HOA tried to fine me for a garden gnome, so I decorated my lawn with 100 of them. So here's the deal. I live in this typical suburban neighborhood where everything's supposed to be all neat and tidy, right? My house, nice and cozy, has this little patch of lawn out front that I like to call my creative space. A few months ago, I found this adorable garden gnome at a flea market. You know, one of those tiny, cheerful-looking ones with a pointy hat. I thought it was harmless fun, so I placed it under a bush near my walkway. A week later, I get this letter from the HOA. Immediate removal required, it said. Apparently, my little gnome didn't conform to the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. Seriously? Aesthetic guidelines? It was a gnome, not a pink flamingo or a busted lawnmower. I was pissed. I mean, what's the big deal about one gnome? The next HOA meeting I decided to attend. Walking in, I could already feel the tension. The HOA president, this stiff guy who looked like he hadn't laughed since the 80s, was going on about maintaining property values. When it was my turn, I asked, "Why is my gnome such a problem?" The guy barely looked up and said, "It's not about the gnome, it's about the principle of maintaining a certain look." Ugh, talk about bureaucratic nonsense. They wanted to fine me $50 if I didn't remove it within a week. I told them I'd think about it, but in my mind, I was already planning my next move. There was no way I was backing down over something so stupid. That night, as I stared at the gnome, I decided to fight back. Why should I let these control freaks dictate what I can and can't have on my own lawn? The next morning, I went online and ordered a few more gnomes. Well, a few might be an understatement. I ordered 50 of them. They arrived over the next week, and I started placing them strategically around my yard. By the end of it, my lawn looked like a gnome convention. The HOA wasn't happy, to say the least. Another letter came, this time with a bigger fine and a more threatening tone. Further non-compliance will result in legal action. It was like they couldn't believe someone was actually standing up to them. They called a special meeting just to address my transgression. They brought in a lawyer who spoke in that condescending, patronizing tone that just made my blood boil. I stood up, told them I'd see them in court if they wanted to push it, and walked out. My neighbors started noticing. Some of them thought it was hilarious. One guy, my next-door neighbor who had always been cool with me, said, "Dude, you're my hero. These guys have been on my case about my Christmas lights for years." Others, the more uptight ones, were clearly on the HOA's side. I started getting weird looks and some nasty notes in my mailbox. One even suggested I was bringing down the value of their home with my tacky display. Whatever. I wasn't backing down. I bought more gnomes. Every time the HOA sent another threatening letter, I added another dozen gnomes. At this point, my yard was a gnome paradise, and I was having way too much fun with it. I started arranging them in little scenes, playing poker, having a barbecue, even reenacting famous movie scenes. The Godfather gnomes were a particular favorite. The gnome saga was the talk of the neighborhood. Some people loved it, others hated it. The HOA, of course, hated it the most. They started getting desperate. A letter came, signed by several board members, saying they were escalating the matter legally. I couldn't believe they were actually taking this to court over a bunch of garden gnomes. One day, I was out rearranging my gnomes when a couple of neighbors walked over. They were older, had lived in the neighborhood forever. They said they were sick of the HOA's crap too. Apparently, the HOA had been harassing them about their hedges and even the color of their mailbox. They offered to help me in any way they could. It was nice to know I wasn't alone in this. Word got around, and soon enough, I had a little group of supporters. We started jokingly calling ourselves the Gnome Army. Someone even made t-shirts. The local news caught wind of the story, and suddenly, my gnomes were famous. I got interviewed, and the HOA's hypocrisy was put on blast. The president refused to comment, of course, probably realizing they looked like idiots. Still, the HOA wouldn't back down. They officially filed a complaint, and I got a court summons. It felt surreal. I was about to go to court over garden gnomes. The support from my neighbors was great, but the pressure was mounting. I was nervous. What if I lost and had to pay a huge fine, or worse, remove all the gnomes? It felt like a ridiculous hill to die on. But at this point, it was about more than just the gnomes. It was about standing up to these overreaching assholes. Court day arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. My parents came along for moral support, even though they thought the whole thing was insane. The courtroom was intimidating, and the HOA's lawyer was there, looking smug. The judge was this stern-looking woman who didn't seem to have much patience for either side's nonsense. The HOA's lawyer started, droning on about community standards and how my gnomes were an eyesore and a nuisance. I could feel my blood boiling again. When it was my turn, I stood up and told my side. I talked about how the HOA had been bullying me and others in the community, how the rules were vague and inconsistently enforced, and how it wasn't fair to penalize me for something as harmless as garden gnomes. Then came the testimonies. A few neighbors spoke in my defense, highlighting the ridiculousness of the HOA's actions and how my gnomes actually brought some joy and humor to the neighborhood. The HOA had a couple of people testify about how the gnomes were disturbing and lowered the tone of the area. One woman actually broke down in tears, which felt a bit over the top for plastic gnomes. The judge listened to everything, and then came the worst part, waiting for her decision. She finally spoke, acknowledging that while the HOA had a point about community guidelines, they were overreaching and not applying the rules fairly. She ruled that I could keep a limited number of gnomes, but had to tone it down a bit. It was a mixed bag, but it felt like a win. The HOA looked pissed, and that was enough for me. After the ruling, things were tense. The HOA was clearly bitter, but they had to back off. I kept a smaller, more modest display of gnomes, and life started to go back to normal. Well, mostly. The gnome army still had our t-shirts, and every now and then we'd have a little gnome-themed get-together just to piss off the HOA. The funny thing is, after all this, there was actually a change in the HOA leadership. The president stepped down, and a few more reasonable folks took over. They even started a committee to review and potentially revise the HOA rules, which was a big deal. It felt like a small victory for the neighborhood, not just for me. Looking back, it was a crazy ride. I never expected to become the local hero, or villain, depending on who you ask, over something so silly. But it wasn't just about the gnomes. It was about standing up for myself and not letting some power-tripping committee dictate every little thing about my life. Updates. So, a few weeks after the court case, things have been interesting. The HOA is still there, but they're a lot quieter now. I think they realize they overstepped. Meanwhile, the neighborhood is kind of rallying around this whole gnome thing. We even had a gnome fest where people brought over their own garden gnomes for a day. It was hilarious and surprisingly heartwarming. The new HOA committee members even showed up and seemed to be in good spirits. I guess some good came out of all this chaos. A couple of months down the line, and it looks like the HOA is actually changing. They've introduced a more transparent process for rule changes and are involving more people in the decisions. They've also relaxed some of the more ridiculous rules, like the ones about seasonal decorations. It's a far cry from where we started, and I think the whole neighborhood feels a bit more relaxed. The new HOA president even came by to chat and seemed genuinely interested in making things better. It's like a weight has lifted off everyone's shoulders. It's been a few months since the whole gnome saga, and I've had some time to reflect. Honestly, it was a lot more stressful than I let on. There were times when I wondered if it was worth it. But then I look at my little gnome army and remember why I did it. Sometimes you just have to stand up for what you believe in, even if it's something as silly as garden gnomes. The neighborhood feels more united now, and I've made some great friends through this whole ordeal. So yeah, no regrets. And to anyone dealing with a power-hungry HOA, hang in there. Sometimes a little defiance is exactly what you need. That's the full story, guys. Thanks for sticking with me through all this craziness. And remember, never underestimate the power of a well-placed garden gnome.